Here's the ultimate 5-step guide to crushing low-stakes poker. Whether you play 1-2, 1-3, 2-5, or 5-5, these 5 steps will allow you to crush the games and move up stakes fast. Be sure to stick around for lesson number 5, because this is way different, I think, than a lot of the advice out there for low-stakes live poker. Let's jump into the meat and potatoes. Step number 1 to crushing low-stakes live games: be the aggressor pre-flop. Either be the one who raises, or if somebody else raises, I'm generally just going to play a 3-bet or fold strategy. When you're playing low stakes, the rake is going to be a huge factor. So you just kind of want to play tighter and you want to play fewer pots. And when you do come into the pot, you want to play bigger pots. Pretty simple, right? The mistakes players make pre-flop in low stakes games: they call too much and they under 4-bet. So you're just going to want to 3-bet more of your good hands because they're not going to be folding. And since they're not going to be 4-betting all that often, they're just not going to blow you off your equity with bluffs. Also, you realize your biggest edge playing pots heads up. When you go multi-way, you just kind of got to make a hand a lot of the times. But if you're the one who's aggressively 3-betting, you actually don't have to always make a hand to win. So there are a couple exceptions for when I'm not going to play 3-bet or fold. Those 3 exceptions are: 1, when I'm in the big blind, closing the action, we can just do a lot of calling. Number 2, when I'm on the button, we're going to be last to act post-flop, which is really nice, so we can work in some flats on the button. And number 3, this is kind of a rare exception in low stakes games, but let's say a very strong player opens from early position, you're next to act, and there's multiple huge whales behind you. That's a situation where I may flat some strong hands because the strong player from early position isn't going to be making a ton of mistakes, but the whales behind me are going to be making all those mistakes. So I want to let the guys in the pot who are going to be making 100 big blind mistakes post-flop. So again, be the pre-flop aggressor, whether you're the one opening or you're the one 3-betting. We just like to be aggressive pre-flop when playing at low stakes. Step number 2 to crushing low stakes live poker games: c-bet your entire range when heads up in position. There's a couple reasons why we want to c-bet our entire range in position. The 2 mistakes the population generally makes when you start c-betting range are: number 1, they under check raise as a bluff. They just call too much and play their draws kind of too passively, which allows you to realize your equity. And number 2, they fast play their value a little bit too much, whether they have 2 pair or a set or a straight. They just start raising this stuff off right now because they don't want a bad run out to come out. So when they start check raising, it's generally pretty easy to play against them because they're under bluffing and they just have too much value. So let's kind of look at this from a solver perspective to show you why you can get away with c-betting range heads up in position. All right, so let's look at this board. We opened the button and the big blind called, and the flop is Jack 9 deuce with a couple of spades. And I just simplified and gave the solver either the option for us in position to either bet half pot or to check back, and then I solve. And you'll see here the solver is betting about half the time for half pot. And you see when we bet, they are playing some of their draws aggressively. For example, they're raising off some of their open-enders like 10-8 of clubs. They're raising off some of their king-queen 2 overs and a gut shot. Some of their just gut shots like king 10. Generally, they're just playing relatively aggressively with their draws. But what happens, right? What happens if our opponent starts playing their draws just a little bit too passively and starts fast playing their value a little bit too much? So we can do something called node locking, and what we can do is we can go in and say they fast play their 2 pair quite a bit more on this wet dynamic board, right? Say around 75% of the time, they are just fast playing when they have Jack 9 here. The sets are going to fast play again about 75% of the time. And then let's say they play their draws a little bit more passively. So let's look at when they have flush draws here. Let's say they only raise about 10% of the time. When they have the open in straight draws, let's say they only raise about 10% of the time. And when they have the gut shots, let's say they only raise about 5% of the time, but they just never fold these gut shots to a half pot size. C-bet here, and we see with their combo draws, we will still let them be aggressive with the combo draws. So they're going to fast play their value a little bit more, and they're also going to play their draws just slightly more passively. We're going to lock that, we're going to save, and we are going to sim, and then we're going to see what happens. All right, so we have simmed, and now we see with them just playing their draws a little bit more passively and fast playing a little bit more. We are now c-betting 85% of the time and checking back only 15% of the time. Essentially, we can just be betting range in this spot. When you see the solver start betting 85, 90% of the time, you can just kind of simplify and bet range. So you see, because our opponents are generally playing a little bit too passively and fast playing their value, they're just playing pretty predictably against us. It just becomes a pretty easy and profitable strategy to start c-betting our entire range. Now, here's the extra bonus on top. These ranges are optimal ranges. So this is the out of position range here. This is if they're playing a completely optimal 200 big blind strategy, right? This is a solved 200 big blind strategy. They're always 3-betting off their suited broadways. They're folding a lot of their trash pre when we open the button to 4x. They are just going to always 3-bet 10s plus, ace king off, mostly ace queen off here. So you see they're just playing pretty aggressively pre-flop and also playing relatively tight from the big blind. Well, what happens here if we actually give them a range that they're actually defending from the big blind? So let's look what happens. So what we did, how do we come up with a range they're playing from the big blind? We purchased 80 million hands. We purchased an 80 million hand sample, and we looked at the hands that recreational players are defending from the big blind to a button open online. Now, not going to translate perfectly to live, but I think it's going to translate a hell of a lot better than looking at what an optimal defend is from the big blind. So let's go ahead and open that up here, and we see this is what more of a MDA or mass data analysis range is from the big blind when we open the button. We see just a lot more suited hands defended. We see it less 3-betting with some of these middling hands like Queen Jack suited or Jack 10 suited. These hands just come in as flats more. The Ace 5 suited is flatting more. So this looks like a more realistic range that a recreational player would defend from the blind. And again, we made some of those adjustments on the flop. And now look at this. We are betting 91% of the time. So any way you slice it, when you're playing live low stakes poker, just c-betting your entire range heads up when in position is going to be a profitable, simple, winning strategy. All right, guys, I just ask one thing of you. Please hit that subscribe button. If you subscribe to the channel, more people will see this video. People will get better at poker. Poker will become harder to beat, and you will earn less money. All right, step number 3 to crushing low stakes live cash games. Check your entire range when you are the pre-flop raiser heads up out of position. So let's say the button opens, you 3-bet the small blind, and the button calls. Now you should be checking your entire range as the pre-flop raiser. This may seem counterintuitive because before, when we were in position, we were betting our entire range. So why are we checking our entire range when we're out of position? Well, for a couple reasons. Generally, low stakes live poker players, the mistakes they make when you check to them is they stab too much, they don't protect their check back range, they telegraph strength with their sizing on the flop. They put too many of their good hands in a big size. They put too many of their weak or medium hands in a small size. And when they do bet, our value can put in massive check raises and just play huge, huge, huge pots. So let me show you again, we'll go back to the solver and let me show you why we are checking range out of position when we are the pre-flop raiser. So let us pull up a sim here, and again, this is going to be a Jack 9 deuce board, but the difference here now is the button has opened. We have 3-bet from the small blind, so we have a tighter range here. This is our range from 3-betting from the small blind, and then the button has defended. Again, these are MDA ranges, which we've pulled from 80 million hands. What happens? What range does the button get here with when the button opens, the small blind 3-bets, and the button calls? So to make things simple, I just gave us either a 40% pot size bet or a check. And you'll see again here in equilibrium, we are checking about half the time. We are betting about half the time. Okay, now let's go ahead and look what happens if we check. All right, so let's go through and lock this again, and let's look at what our opponents are doing when we check on the flop. Sets, let's say they put their sets in the bigger size a little bit more. Let's say they put their 2 pair in the bigger size, just a little bit more. Let's look what they're doing with top pair here. And on a Jack 9 deuce board with a flush draw, I think you would agree, I would agree, my grandmother would agree that recreational players are just not checking back top pair no matter what size they use. Let's say they check back 20% of the time with top pair. They just use the big size for protection a little bit more. And then sometimes when they have protection, let's say they have like a 9x hand, I think they're just going to be betting that a little bit more when we check. Let's say like 50-50, maybe a hand like pocket 10s bets a little bit more for protection here. So they have some more protection bets and they're just not checking back their top pair nearly as much. So they're just sizing up a bit when they have top pair plus. So when they have ace jack, 2 pair sets here, they're just going to use the bigger size here to protect against flushes, straights, whatever. So let's lock that. Let's save and close, and we will sim this right now. All right, we are done simming. You will see before we were betting 50% of the time on this flop. Now we are checking 100% of the time on this flop. You see here that just very quickly, if they start telegraphing their strength of hand with their sizing just a little bit, and they start just betting top pair or for protection a little bit too much, all of a sudden we just start checking all of the time. And you may say, okay, that's all well and good, but the board is Jack 9 deuce. What about on a board like Ace King 3 that's much better for us? Shouldn't we be betting on that board? That's a good question. Let's look at that. All right, so let's open up a sim here, and we are looking at Ace King 3 now with a flush draw, same ranges. The button opened, we 3-bet from the small blind. In equilibrium, we're betting about 50% of the time on Ace King 3 with the flush draw as the pre-flop 3-better here. But let's start locking when we check, and let's see what happens. All right, so let's first look what they're doing with their 2 pair. That looks about right. Sets. That looks about right as well. Now let's look what they're doing with their top pair, their ace-x. You see they're checking back 70% of the time. I think you can agree, my grandmother could agree. This is just, it's not happening on Ace King 3 with a flush draw. They're just betting their top pair much more often. Now, on this type of board that is a little bit more static, that is ace high, they may have some checkbacks with top pair. They're gonna have more checkbacks with ace-x on this board than they would with jack-x on Jack 9-3, but they're still just gonna be betting much more than this. So let's turn the checking frequency here down to say 33%, 1/3 of the time. We won't go too crazy with this, except you see here with all of these just like small pairs, they're just stabbing and betting huge quite a bit. I think we can all agree that's just not happening. So we'll have them check back with these hands quite a bit. And if they are stabbing, they're just gonna stab small. And now let's go ahead and lock this. We will save and close, and then we will sim, and we will look at the results. So we're gonna sim. All right, and here is our new strategy once we just have them betting top pair just a little bit more on this board. And as you can see, we're essentially just now range checking here. You see we're betting 12% of the time. Again, simplified solution here. It's much better to play a simple strategy that you can execute 100% of the time than try to integrate kind of a complex strategy where you're balancing like 2 bet sizes or 3 bet sizes and a check. Just a very simple strategy that you can play profitably here would be to check your entire range. And you see, this is an Ace King 3 board where we 3-bet the small blind versus the button opened, and us as the pre-flop 3-better, we're just essentially checking range here. So again, the reasons you want to check range, they're going to stab too much when they're in position. They're going to telegraph the strength of their hand with their sizing. And maybe even most importantly, which we're not going to get into too much detail now, but maybe a good topic for a future video, when the flop goes check, check, they just don't have any good hands, and it gives us kind of carte blanche to just bluff on turns and rivers. So step number 3 to crushing low stakes live poker games: when you are the pre-flop aggressor and you're out of position heads up, check your entire range. Step number 4 to crushing low stakes live poker: fold to aggression. Okay, so there's this common myth that recreational players don't bluff. They do bluff, but they bluff when you give them rope, right? So if you check back a street, if you're the pre-flop caller, if you are not showing aggression and you're just kind of in a check calling shell, that's when recreational players bluff. But if you're the pre-flop raiser, so you raise pre, you c-bet the flop, you bet the turn, they massively underbluff. So if they fight aggression with aggression, you should be folding almost everything, and I'm going to show you why with an example right here. So again, let's look at this board, Jack 9 deuce. We're going to switch back to a single raise pot. We open the button, we get called in the big blind. We bet the flop, they call. Turn is a 3 of spades, bringing in the front door flush, and they check to us. So let's go ahead. I just gave us a very small 1/3 pot size bet here on this turn. Let's go ahead and see what happens when we bet, and let's go ahead and just start locking their strategy and making some adjustments for what happens when we bet 1/3 pot here on this turn. So when we bet small on this turn, let's look at what they are doing with their flushes. And I think you can agree, I can agree, my cousin Laramie can agree. They're just going to fast play flushes much more than this on a wet dynamic board when we bet 1/3 pot on the turn when the flush comes in. When players are out of position, the board is a little bit scary, they have a good hand, they are going to fast play, right? If they don't have the kind of invulnerable nuts. So let's say a lot of the flushes just raise off here. Let's say like 80% of the time. But when they have the ace high flush, let's say they trap a little bit more, right? Let's say they call 40% of the time when they have the ace high flush, but when they have all other flushes, they raise 80% of the time. Now let's say here, if they do have a set, they get a little bit scared, so they just start calling with their sets a little bit more. With their 2 pair, again, they're just going to be calling with their 2 pair, and top pair is just going to be calling. Second pair is not going to be raising, going to be mostly calling. So again, we just have them fast playing off their flushes here. And then we have them playing a little bit more passively when they do have draws. When they have hands like king, queen off, king 10 off, queen 10 off, queen 8 off with a spade, they're not going to be turning these hands into a bluff this often on the turn. Let's say they still do it some percent of the time, but they're just not going to do it at this frequency. Kind of these ace high hands with a spade, I don't think we're going to see them play these this aggressively where they're just raising them off this much of the time. So let's say they still bluff, they turn these hands into a bluff sometimes, but it's just not at this frequency. We'll give them like 5% here, and we are going to lock this. We will save and close, and we're going to go through and sim this. And now let's see what happens when we bet on the turn. All right, so first thing you're going to see here is we're just betting a lot now on the turn. Same thing when we started range betting on the flop. So we're just betting so much, but let's look what happens actually when we bet. When we bet 1/3 pot here and they raise, we are folding 88% of the time, okay? We're folding 88% of the time. What are we doing with top pair? Let's look at the EV here with top pair. Top pair is just folding. It is to call here with a hand like ace jack of hearts, we'd be losing $60 when they raise this turn, right? To call here with a hand like king jack of clubs, we'd be losing $60, right? So we're just folding any value hand that isn't a set or better. So you see here with jack 9, we're folding jack 9, just instant muck, and we're just calling with our sets, our flushes, and our naked ace of spade hands. This just shows you how quickly we can just start folding very good hands when people fight aggression with aggression, because it's just hard to find, if they're fast playing this many flushes here, it's just hard to find enough bluffs. They just don't have enough bluffs. So to sum it up, step number 4 to crushing low stakes live poker, when people start fighting aggression with aggression, just start making some LOL folds. They're under bluffing. They just have too much value. It's going to be more profitable for you to make some big folds. All right, finally, let's put it all together. Step number 5 to crushing low stakes live poker, bluff capped ranges. So a lot of the common advice for low stakes poker is don't bluff, people call too much, people don't fold top pair. And I think if you're playing relatively deep, I think that advice is not great. Here's the reason why I think that advice is not great, and I think you should be doing a lot of bluffing when you get to the river. So they get to the river with too many hands because they call too wide pre, call too wide flop, call too wide turn, And on every street, they fast play their good hands along the way. So they just have way too many hands, not enough good hands. They're not going to be able to hang on when you just start betting massive sizes as a bluff on the river. So let's go ahead, let's jump in, let's look at an example of this in action. So we're gonna look at the same sim here, where the flop Jack 9 deuce, turn is a 3 of spades, we bet, and this time instead of raising, they just call. Let's go to a river, and the river is the 4 of clubs, and they check. So I gave us 2 different river sizes here, either an option to bet half pot, which would be $66 into 132, or an option to bet 2.5x pot, which would be to bet $330 into 132. So let's go in and let's start node locking how they play on this river to our 2 bet sizes. First, let's look at what happens when we bet 2.5x pot. And let's go in and let's see what they do with top pair. This looks kind of reasonable here. So let's just say with ace jack, they're just not folding. They're just going to call 100% of the time with ace jack. Let's say with king jack, they're calling about 40% of the time. With queen jack, they're going to call 25%. That looks fine. With jack 10, maybe they'll call 15% of the time. Let's see what they're doing with second pair here. I think we can all agree they're probably not going to be finding these hero calls with 9x on the river where we bet 2x pot after triple barreling on a flushing board. Let's just say they fold the second pair. Let's say they fold these hands like pocket 5s here on this river. And now let's say when they do have the nut flush, they're going to raise, but with their other flushes, they're mostly just going to call here. So with the nut flush, we're going to raise. With the other flushes, they're just going to do some calling. And that looks about right. Let's go ahead and lock this here. And now let's go ahead and lock what happens when we bet half pot on this river. And you'll see they're doing quite a bit of aggressive raising. So let's turn that down because I think we can agree that doesn't happen. Let's say sets raise 50-50 here. Let's say flushes are almost always going to raise. Let's say they're probably not going to be turning 5s into a bluff, right? So let's say top pair is just always going to call. Let's say second pair is going to call about half the time. You see they're just turning when they have like the ace of spades into a bluff. I think that occasionally happens in low stakes games, but not all that often. So let's say maybe 5% of the time they turn these hands into a bluff. And what are we doing with 2 pair here? I think 2 pair, especially on a flushing board, does a little bit more calling. So let's just have them playing a little bit more passively here. Just calling a little bit more with the sets and 2 pair. Of course, they're still raising all their flushes when we bet half pot, but they're just not playing quite as aggressively. So let's go ahead and lock this, save and close. We will sim and we will be right back. All right, so let's go ahead and jump back in. We have solved, and now here is our river strategy. Again, board is Jack 9 deuce. We opened button, big blind called. They check called the flop on Jack 9 deuce, turn on a 3 of spades. We bet small, they called. Now the river is a 4. And here is our strategy after doing a little bit of node locking. And you'll see here, very interestingly, whenever we have a hand that cannot beat 9x, we are essentially just bluffing 2.5x pot now. So you'll see like hands like ace 6 offsuit just going to be bluffing for $330 here almost all the time. Even hands like pocket 6s, pocket 5s, pocket 7s are just turned into a bluff at a high frequency. And then when we have good hands, we're just generally betting small. So if we have a hand like ace jack, the EV of betting half pot going to be much higher than betting 2.5x pot. And you'll see when we have flushes here, the solver is kind of mixing, sometimes betting big and sometimes just betting half pot. So you'll see with like ace king of spades, the EV difference between betting 330 and betting 66, not all that wide. And when we have sets here, like a hand like pocket jacks, or pocket deuces, the solver does prefer to bet half pot. So we're mostly just betting half pot with our good hands and then betting 2.5x with our bluffs. Pretty cool strategy, and one that we are a pretty big advocate for at low stakes. Your bluff size and your value size should generally not be the same size, and that's not always to say your bluff size should be big and your value size should be small. But in this particular spot, when our opponent gets to the river with a capped range, probably best case here for the bluff to be big and the value to be small, just because they're doing a lot of folding. These are the 5 steps to crush low stakes live poker games. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.